October 20th, 2014, a Monday night on Chicago's southwest side. The kind of autumn evening where the air turns sharp and the streetlights seem to flicker on earlier than they should. The city was preparing for another week, another rotation of shift changes and emergency calls, another cycle in the endless machinery of urban life. At 9:47 p.m., a call came into the Chicago Police Department's radio dispatch. Reports of a young man acting erratically near 41st Street and Pulaski Road, walking in the street, possibly attempting to break into vehicles. The caller mentioned something else. He was carrying a knife. For police officers across Chicago, this type of call was familiar, a mental health episode, a young person in distress, the kind of situation that, handled properly, ends with a welfare check, perhaps a hospital visit, perhaps just a conversation and a ride home. But on this night, on this street, in this city, with its particular history of tension between police and communities of color, something would go catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. The young man's name was Laquan McDonald. He was 17 years old. In less than 30 seconds, he would be dead.
To understand what happened that night, we need to understand who Laquan McDonald was, not as a police report describes him, not as a statistic, but as a human being whose life had been shaped by forces largely beyond his control. Laquan was born in Chicago in 1997, in the neighborhoods of the South Side, where poverty wasn't just an economic condition, but a multi-generational reality. His early childhood was marked by instability that no child should have to endure. His mother struggled with substance abuse. His father was largely absent from his life. Before Laquan reached adolescence, he had already experienced more displacement than many people experience in a lifetime. Foster care became his reality, not the kind depicted in hopeful movies where caring families provide temporary refuge, but the grinding machinery of an overwhelmed system, group homes with rotating staff, temporary placements that never quite felt temporary enough to settle into, and the psychological toll of never quite knowing where home actually was. The records show that Laquan moved between placements frequently. Each move meant new schools, new faces, new rules. For a child already dealing with trauma, this constant upheaval compounded his struggles. He began exhibiting signs of emotional distress. Teachers noted difficulties with regulation and focus. He had run-ins with authority. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health conditions, diagnoses that, in a different context, with different resources, might have led to comprehensive treatment and support. But Laquan was a Black teenager in a system not designed to save children like him. He was cycling through institutions that were underfunded, overwhelmed, and often indifferent. Mental health care was sporadic at best. Stability was a concept, not a reality. By October 2014, Laquan had been living in a group home. Those who knew him described a young man who could be charming and funny, who loved basketball, who still harbored hopes for his future despite everything working against him. He was also a young man carrying deep pain, struggling with impulses he couldn't always control, navigating a world that had shown him little mercy. On that Monday evening, something triggered him. We may never fully understand what. Perhaps it was a confrontation at the group home. Perhaps it was the accumulation of years of trauma manifesting in a single, terrible moment of crisis. What we know is that he left his placement, that he was agitated, that he was carrying a 3-inch folding knife, the kind available at any hardware store, and that he was walking the streets of his city, alone, in distress. Someone should have helped him that night. Instead, someone killed him. By the time Officer Jason Van Dyke arrived on scene at approximately 9:57 p.m., the situation had already been contained, or at least it should have been. Multiple Chicago Police Department units were already present. Squad cars had positioned themselves strategically around the area. Officers had been following Laquan at a distance, maintaining visual contact, communicating over radio about his movements and behavior. Standard protocol for a mental health crisis call. Create distance,
establish communication if possible, wait for backup, consider calling for crisis intervention specialists. The radio transmissions from those minutes tell a revealing story. Officers reported that the subject was walking away from them, that he was not threatening anyone, that he had punctured the tire of a police vehicle, but had not attacked any person. There was concern in their voices. This was an unpredictable situation, but there was no panic, no calls for immediate lethal intervention. One officer would later testify that he believed the situation was being managed, that they were successfully containing Laquan's movements without escalation. Then, Jason Van Dyke arrived. Van Dyke was a veteran of the Chicago Police Department with nearly 15 years of experience. His personnel file would later reveal a troubling pattern: 20 complaints filed against him over his career, including allegations of excessive force, racial slurs, and unnecessary aggression. In most police departments, such a file would trigger intervention, retraining, or reassignment. In Chicago, Van Dyke had never been seriously disciplined. He remained on active patrol, armed and authorized to make life-and-death decisions. As Van Dyke exited his vehicle, the dashboard camera of his patrol car began recording. That camera, a piece of technology designed to create accountability, would become the most important piece of evidence in American criminal justice that year. The footage shows Laquan McDonald walking in the middle of the street, moving diagonally away from police vehicles. His gait is unusual, not quite a walk, not quite a stumble. In his right hand, the knife is visible, blade folded out, hanging at his side. He is not charging, he is not lunging, he is simply walking, a troubled teenager in crisis, surrounded by trained professionals with the tools and training to de-escalate. 6 seconds after exiting his vehicle, Jason Van Dyke raised his service weapon, a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, and he began firing. The first bullet struck Laquan McDonald in the chest. The impact spun him partially around. His body began to collapse. Van Dyke continued firing. The second shot, the third. Laquan's body jerked with each impact, his legs giving way beneath him. The fourth shot struck him as he fell. By the fifth shot, Laquan McDonald was on the ground. Officer Van Dyke continued firing. Shot 6, shot 7, puffs of debris visible on the dashboard camera as bullets struck the pavement around Laquan's motionless body. Shot 8, shot 9, shot 10. No other officer fired their weapon. Several would later testify to their shock at watching the shooting continue. Shot 11, shot 12, shot 13. 15 seconds had elapsed since the first shot. Laquan McDonald had been motionless on the ground for at least 10 of those seconds. Shot 14, shot 15, and then shot 16. Silence, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the October air. Radio chatter resuming, calls for an ambulance, for supervisors, for the machinery of official response. And on the pavement, a 17-year-old boy, his life draining away, surrounded by the officers who were supposed to protect him. The autopsy would later reveal the full horror. Bullets had entered Laquan's body from multiple angles. Several had struck him in the back. Others had hit him in the scalp as he lay face down on the asphalt. The pattern of wounds told an unmistakable story. This was not a split-second decision in the heat of combat. This was sustained, deliberate force applied to a person who no longer posed any threat. But in those first minutes after the shooting, a different story was already being constructed.
Within hours of Laquan McDonald's death, a narrative emerged. The official police reports described a violent confrontation. They stated that Laquan had lunged at officers with the knife, that he had raised the weapon in a threatening manner, that Officer Van Dyke had no choice but to use deadly force to protect himself and his fellow officers. Other officers on scene provided statements supporting this account. The wording was remarkably consistent: imminent threat, aggressive actions, no choice but to fire. Independent civilian witnesses, people who had seen the shooting from their cars, from nearby businesses, told a different story. They described a young man who is not attacking anyone, who fell quickly, who was shot repeatedly while on the ground. But their statements were not included in the initial reports. Some claimed they were never seriously interviewed. Others said their accounts were dismissed or minimized. The department's protocol required that any officer-involved shooting be investigated. But within Chicago PD, there was a culture of closing ranks, of protecting fellow officers, of viewing any criticism as an attack on all police. The investigation into Van Dyke's shooting of Laquan McDonald was cursory at best. By the next morning, less than 12 hours after a teenager had been shot 16 times, the official determination was made: justified use of force. Officer Van Dyke returned to desk duty. His weapon returned to him. No charges were filed. The case, from the department's perspective, was closed. But there was a problem with this neat conclusion. The dashboard camera footage existed, and people were beginning to ask why they couldn't see it. The city of Chicago fought the release of that video with remarkable determination. When Laquan McDonald's family requested the footage, they were told it was part of an ongoing investigation. When journalists filed Freedom of Information Act requests, they were denied. When an independent journalist named Brandon Smith filed a lawsuit demanding release, the city's lawyers argued that making the video public would compromise the integrity of potential prosecutions. This argument was darkly ironic, given that no prosecutions had been initiated and none appeared forthcoming. For 13 months, the video remained sealed. 13 months during which the official narrative stood unchallenged in formal documents. 13 months during which Jason Van Dyke collected his salary, during which Laquan McDonald's family grieved without answers, during which Chicago's leadership hoped the case would fade from public memory. The city did offer one response: a settlement. Laquan's family was offered $5 million in a wrongful death suit before they had even filed a lawsuit. The settlement came with no admission of wrongdoing, but its mere existence raised questions. Why would the city pay millions of dollars if the shooting was justified? Still, the video remained hidden until a judge ordered its release. On November 24, 2015, more than a year after Laquan McDonald's death, the city of Chicago was finally forced to make the dashboard camera footage public. What happened next would change the trajectory of American policing. The video was released late on a Tuesday evening. Within minutes, it had been downloaded, uploaded to social media, shared across news networks, viewed millions of times. And America watched in horror. Because the video showed, beyond any possible ambiguity, that nearly every element of the official police narrative was false. Laquan McDonald did not lunge at officers. He walked away from them. He did not raise the knife in a threatening manner toward Van Dyke. His arm remained at his side. He was not shot in self-defense during an active confrontation. He was shot while moving away, then shot repeatedly while lying motionless on the ground. The video, stark and grainy but utterly clear in its essential facts, revealed not just a shooting, but a cover-up. Every officer who had signed those reports, every supervisor who had approved them, every city official who had accepted them without question, all were now implicated in a lie that had been maintained for 13 months. Chicago exploded. Protests filled the streets. Demonstrators marched through downtown, shutting down Michigan Avenue during the busiest shopping week of the year. They chanted 16 shots and a cover-up. They demanded accountability. They demanded resignations. They demanded justice. The political fallout was swift and severe. Gary McCarthy, Chicago's police superintendent, was fired within days. Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who had overseen the city's efforts to keep the video hidden, saw his approval ratings collapse. Calls for his resignation echoed across the city. The trust between Chicago's black communities and its police department, already fragile, shattered completely. But the crisis went deeper than any single official.
The Laquan McDonald case had exposed something systemic, a culture within Chicago PD that protected officers at all costs, that viewed accountability as betrayal, that would construct false narratives and suppress evidence rather than admit wrongdoing. And now, finally, there would be consequences. On November 24, 2015, the same day the video was released, Jason Van Dyke was charged with first-degree murder. This was extraordinary. Police officers in America are almost never charged with crimes for on-duty shootings. Even in cases involving highly questionable force, prosecutors typically defer to the doctrine of officer discretion, accepting claims of fear and split-second decision-making. The law gives police wide latitude to use force, and the criminal justice system has historically been extremely reluctant to second-guess those decisions. Van Dyke's charging represented a break with that pattern, forced not by the system's conscience, but by undeniable video evidence and overwhelming public pressure. The trial took place in September 2018, nearly 4 years after Laquan's death. The prosecution's case was built around that dashboard camera footage, shown repeatedly to the jury. Use of force experts testified that Van Dyke's actions violated every standard of reasonable police practice. The medical examiner described the trajectory of each bullet, painting a clinical picture of sustained violence against an incapacitated person. Van Dyke's defense team argued that he had acted out of genuine fear, that from his perspective, approaching a subject with a knife, he believed his life was in danger, that the stress of police work, the split-second nature of the encounter, justified his response. They presented Van Dyke as a dedicated officer making a tragic mistake under pressure, but there was no escaping that video. The jury watched it over and over. They counted the shots. They observed the timing. They saw what anyone with eyes could see. Whatever threat Laquan McDonald might have posed ended the moment he hit the ground. On October 5, 2018, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty of first-degree murder. The jury apparently could not agree that Van Dyke had entered the situation with intent to kill, but guilty of second-degree murder, a conviction that acknowledged he had caused Laquan's death without legal justification, and guilty on all 16 counts of aggravated battery, 1 for each bullet. Jason Van Dyke became one of the first Chicago police officers in decades to be convicted of murder for an on-duty shooting. He was sentenced to 6 years and 9 months in prison. The conviction of Jason Van Dyke was important, but it was not enough.
At this point, it's important to say this. If you value fact-based investigations, if you believe power should always be examined, and if you want more stories like this told carefully and responsibly, subscribe to this channel. Your support allows these cases to be documented, preserved, and examined without distortion.
Because Laquan McDonald's death was not the product of one officer's actions on one terrible night, it was the product of a system that had failed at every level. The United States Department of Justice launched a comprehensive civil rights investigation into the Chicago Police Department. The resulting report, released in January 2017, was devastating in its findings. The DOJ investigation found patterns of excessive force, particularly against Black and Latino residents. It found officers using force that was unnecessary, disproportionate, and poorly documented. It found a disciplinary system that rarely held officers accountable, even for egregious violations. It found a code of silence that discouraged reporting misconduct. It found training that was inadequate and supervision that was ineffective. The report described a department where officers felt empowered to use violence with minimal oversight, where complaints were routinely dismissed, where the culture valued loyalty to fellow officers above service to the community. Chicago PD was placed under a federal consent decree, a court-ordered reform process requiring comprehensive changes to policies, training, accountability mechanisms, and community relations. The decree represented an acknowledgement that change could not come from within. External oversight was necessary.
The reforms mandated included new use of force policies emphasizing de-escalation, enhanced crisis intervention training, improved systems for investigating officer misconduct, increased transparency around police data, and community input into policy decisions. Implementation has been slow and uneven. Changing institutional culture is difficult. Resistance from within the department has been significant. Years after the consent decree was established, Chicago still struggles with many of the same problems. But the Laquan McDonald case changed the conversation. It made undeniable what many communities had been saying for decades, that police abuse is often not about individual bad actors, but about systems that enable, protect, and excuse violence.
Today, Laquan McDonald's name is remembered alongside others in the long American struggle for police accountability. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. A painful litany of names that should still be connected to living people with futures and families and dreams. There is a tendency, when discussing these cases, to focus on the character of the victims, to examine their backgrounds, their decisions, their actions in the moments before their deaths, as if finding some flaw might explain or justify what happened to them. But Laquan McDonald's story is not about whether he was perfect. He was 17 years old, troubled and traumatized, in crisis on a city street. He was a child whom the system had failed repeatedly before that night. Even if every element of the initial police reports had been true, which they were not, the question remains, why did this encounter have to end in death? Police officers are trained to de-escalate. They have non-lethal options. They have communication skills. They are supposed to be the professionals in these situations, the ones who can manage conflict without resorting to maximum force. That training, those tools, that professional responsibility, all of it failed Laquan McDonald. And then the system compounded that failure by lying about it. The cover-up, in many ways, was worse than the shooting itself. A terrible decision in a moment of pressure is a tragedy, but a coordinated institutional effort to hide the truth, to construct false narratives, to suppress evidence for over a year, that reveals something deeply corrupt about the system itself. The Laquan McDonald case taught America a critical lesson. Cameras matter. Body cameras, dashboard cameras, civilian phone cameras, they create evidence that cannot be dismissed or explained away. They transform he said, she said into verifiable fact. Before the widespread use of cameras, countless police narratives went unchallenged. How many Laquan McDonalds were there in the decades before video evidence became common, whose deaths were simply accepted at the official version? We will never know. But we know now that video evidence can force accountability. It can overcome the institutional tendency to protect its own. It can give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. The weight of 16 shots. On a southwest side street in Chicago, there is a small memorial where Laquan McDonald fell. People leave flowers there sometimes, candles, notes, expressions of grief and anger and hope for change. Laquan himself remains frozen in time, forever 17, forever that troubled teenager in crisis. We can imagine who he might have become with different support, different chances, different encounters with authority. But we will never know. Those possibilities died with him. His mother, Tina Hunter, has spoken periodically about her son, about his love of basketball, about his struggles, and her own failures to protect him in a system that offered so little support, about the pain of learning of his death, and then, 13 months later, of seeing how he died. Jason Van Dyke served approximately 3 years in prison before being released in 2022. He lives today as a convicted murderer, the rare police officer who faced criminal consequences for on-duty actions. His supporters still maintain he was unjustly prosecuted. His detractors argue his sentence was far too lenient for taking a young life. The Chicago Police Department continues its slow, difficult reform process. Some officers have embraced new training and accountability measures. Others resist change, viewing reforms as an attack on their profession. The culture war over policing continues, with Laquan McDonald's case invoked by both those demanding change and those defending traditional police practices. But beyond the politics, beyond the institutional debates, there is a simple human truth. A 17-year-old boy walked down a Chicago street one October night. He should have received help. He should have been de-escalated, calmed, taken for evaluation, connected with mental health services. Instead, within seconds, he was shot 16 times. And then, the people whose job was to serve and protect him lied about how he died. That is Laquan McDonald's story. It is a story about what happens when institutions value self-protection over truth, when officers are trained to see community members as threats rather than people, when accountability is treated as optional, when cameras are fought rather than embraced. The 16 shots fired that night echo still. They echo in ongoing debates about police reform. They echo in community distrust. They echo in the slow, painful work of building something better. Laquan McDonald's life mattered. His death mattered. And the truth about both, finally brought to light by video that could not be denied, continues to matter. Because in the end, justice delayed is still injustice. But truth, even when it comes late, even when it is fought at every step, still has power. The power to reveal, the power to demand accountability, the power to insist that we can do better, that we must do better. For Laquan, and for every person who deserves to walk their city's streets without fear of those who were sworn to protect them. This is the story of Laquan McDonald. May his memory continue to push us toward a more just and accountable system.